Hello, everyone. So I'm Kevin Lenaburg. I am the policy director for Clusterbusters and the executive director of the Psychedelics and Pain Association. You'll hear plenty more about both of these organizations throughout our presentations, but we like to start better understanding our audience that we have tonight. So cameras are all pointed forward, so please don't worry about anything on camera, but by show of hands, we want to see who here is a healthcare provider. Healthcare. Okay. Who here is a therapist? And obviously that can be overlapping for some people. Okay. Who here has ever used psychedelics across their life? Okay. If you're willing to say, has anyone here has never used psychedelics, but maybe is here curious to learn more? Okay. Now let's talk pain. Pain touches all of us. So whether it's yourself or someone that you know, who here has ever had a severe painful condition at some point in their life? Okay. A lot of being touched by that. How many people currently are living with a chronic pain condition? Okay. And how many people here love someone or are really close with someone who's dealing with chronic pain? Yeah. Pretty much everyone there. So that just shows how widespread this problem is, and that's why the work that we're both doing is trying to address that. So our first presenter here is Bob Wold, who is the founder and executive director of Clusterbusters, which started back in 2002. It focuses on cluster headache, and for many years they've known about psychedelics being the most effective treatment. So I'll let Bob explain his whole story, and take it away, Bob.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kevin, and I'm really honored to be here. Sometimes it's easier to get a spot speaking to a room full of neurologists than it is to speak to a room full of people that are really interested in psychedelics. So I feel really at ease here, so thank you. And just real quickly, just so you know, I didn't pick this jacket and this hat for this group. I wear the exact same thing if there's 400 neurologists. I've learned that I need to be really bold to get our story out. So, but thank you all for being here. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to start off with a little bit about my life before clusters and then my life with clusters. This picture here, this is when my cluster life started. I was in my mid-20s, starting a family, having a great, joyful life. It's a picture of my oldest son, who now also has 2 young girls at home, and he's holding my youngest daughter. And I went from learning to be a father, because it's a learning experience, to learn what a trigeminal nerve does. And I was actually playing football on a Sunday afternoon with my son, playing catch, and my head started to hurt, and quickly came into the house and sat down and had the worst experience that I had ever had in my life. And I had felt pain up to that point because I was in construction, and it hurts a lot when you drop a 100-pound piece of plywood on your big toe. So I had experienced pain, but I did not experience anything that lasted that long. And I had no idea what it was. But it went away quickly. It lasted about an hour and it went away. The next day it happened to me again. And I thought I needed to see a doctor because I didn't know if my head was going to blow up or what it was going to do, or if I was having an aneurysm or what was happening. What that led to was 4 years of a lot of questions that I had and only bad answers. After seeing quite a few doctors, I was told, I was referred to a chiropractor who I explained what I was going through. And are there any chiropractors in the room? Good. I'm safe. I would say this anyways, but because I would like to, I like to educate people, but this chiropractor told me that if he couldn't cure my headaches in 3 visits, then I probably had a brain tumor. So after 3 visits, my head was worse. Through 3 very long procedures, and it was terrible. But then he put it into my head that I might have a brain tumor. So I decided, well, that is a possibility, and I should really find out what's going on. So through the first 20 years that I had cluster headaches, I was going through 2 cycles per year. I don't know if you know how clusters are defined, but we have what are called cluster cycles, and we're all a little bit different. Some people have 1 3-week long cycle every other year. They come on very quickly the same time of the year and end abruptly exactly the same amount of time year after year, cycle after cycle. So if your cycle is 6 weeks of having an attack at 2 p.m. and 3 a.m., you're going to have those same 2 attacks every day within minutes on the clock until your cycle ends. So they're really predictable, which has two things about it. It's really nice to know when the next one's going to be coming on so you can plan your day and get dinner over before your 7 o'clock attack. But the downside of that is knowing when you're going to get hit and planning that last hour, getting ready and knowing what you're about to go through. So it's things like that that are really difficult to deal with. Besides the pain, there are some autonomic features that your eye will tear, your nose on that side will run, the pain can come down the side of your face. It follows that trigeminal nerve, and it'll run from your temple, for most people, from your temple down to your lower jaw and your lower teeth. But you can't tell which direction that's going because you're not getting any answers as far as what it is you have. So a lot of people think that it's starting in their lower jaw and their teeth and moving upwards. So 40% of people with cluster headaches, before they're diagnosed with clusters, have something done in the dentist's office. Root canals, tooth extraction. People in my community have had every tooth pulled in their mouth in their 20s without getting any relief. Before they stop going to the dentist, they have no teeth left. 5 of those 20 years I was chronic, which meant I had these attacks every day the same time for 5 years. I did not have a headache-free day for 5 years. I was told, I knew I had clusters at that point, and I was told that some people go from episodic to chronic, but they never, once they go to chronic, they stay there and never return to episodic. But after 5 years, luckily, I returned to episodic and was only spending 6 months out of every year with cluster headache attacks. So I thought I was pretty lucky to get half of my life back. So to put a face on cluster headache, which a lot of people don't know, and there's been a lot of discussion about what somebody with cluster headaches looks like for years and years, decades. The demographics showed that cluster headaches was about 8-1 male versus female. A lot of the research looked towards that and tried to find out why men are having cluster headaches more often. With our work over the last 25 years, that number has actually come down to about 3-1 male versus female. And that's not because fewer men are having cluster headaches. It's because a lot more women are now being diagnosed with cluster headaches after decades of being treated improperly for migraine. A woman walks into a neurologist's office, explains the head pain, and immediately gets diagnosed with migraine. Once that's in your medical records, it travels everywhere you go to every doctor. This particular face that you're looking at there is sort of a rare occurrence, thank God, but it really shows some of the things that we're feeling and going through with an attack. This is a guy that had an attack, walked to the mirror to look at himself, and this is what he saw. He did not punch himself in the face. During these attacks, there is a lot of self-abuse, trying to get your mind off of the pain. Many of my friends have the same thought of, for a long time, what I would do, I would run into the shower and switch from icy cold water to hot water on my head. And I could actually feel, when I went under the cold water, I could feel my head actually shrinking and cracking. But that would take my mind off the pain and it would get me through an hour attack in the shower. And a lot of times I would just bang my head on a ceramic tile, trying to knock myself out. And it seems to me, I mean, no doctor has confirmed this, but it seems to me that the pain just transcends the body's ability to actually shut down. This guy woke up, saw himself in the mirror, and that was the result of one cluster headache attack. The chart on the left there was a large survey, largest cluster headache survey that was ever done, comparing pain levels. And all of these numbers are based on people who suffer some other painful condition and cluster headaches, and how they rated that pain to their cluster headache attack. So I'm sure some of you here see yourself on this list. I've had 2 heart attacks. I wouldn't even rate those as a 5 compared to cluster headache attacks. But one of the things that this research did for us was the comparison of gunshot wound at 6.24. There were 29 people that had gunshot wounds and could compare that to their cluster headaches. It wasn't a cluster headache attack person trying to compare themselves to migraine or anything else. They were comparing their own pain. Clusters came out at 9.59. I'll touch a little bit more on that gunshot wound, but that was one thing that helped us finally get oxygen approved after a 10-year struggle with CMS, so that people on Medicare and Medicaid were able to get oxygen. 10 years, so you can imagine how long it's going to take us to get psilocybin or LSD approved by Medicare for payment. I'm more than happy to talk to anybody that's on that flight. So suicidality, almost 70% of people with cluster headache have contemplated suicide during an attack. Some contemplate that every time they get an attack. Some just try to stop thinking about it and cut it down to, I sometimes think about it. But that picture there is a picture of a cluster headache attack sufferer who really understood that chart on pain. And you can see here where a gunshot wound being in a 6 is not as scary as it is to somebody that doesn't have cluster headaches and thinks that I can handle a 6, I can no longer handle a 9. So this is a picture of somebody who tried to commit suicide with a shotgun and woke up in the hospital, revived in the hospital, and survived, and had a cluster headache attack when he awoke. The first 20 years of my cluster life, these are all of the different medications that I tried in hundreds of combinations, almost all of them in either double or triple the dosage levels that these drugs were approved for what they were developed to treat. An example of that is Kalen is a blood pressure medication that was developed, and it's usually dosed at 80 milligrams or 120 milligrams with people having those vascular issues. Doctors that prescribe this for cluster headache prescribe it all the way up to 1,400 milligrams every day, and then deal with the side effects of that. People show up at our conference with colostomy bags because of verapamil and Kalen that they're told it's really benign, has no side effects. Those people need to show up at one of my conferences. The only ones that had any effect at all are in red. None of them provided long-term relief. And one of them there, the one Sansert, methosurgide. Methosurgide was actually a modified LSD molecule, and it was taken 2 milligrams a day every day. Doing that, and the way they modified it, built in a side effect that turned soft tissue organs into fibrous masses. And it was finally pulled off the market because the market was too small for it, for the manufacturer to keep on making it, and just decided to pull it from the market. But it was really effective, especially for people that are chronic daily. It was very helpful. So the people that needed it the most, their medicine that worked for them was pulled off the market. So after those first 20 years, I had a lot of really difficult choices to make. I was considering 3 different surgeries, one of those gamma knife, where they were going to cut off part of my brain with gamma knife waves at Northwestern in Chicago. I would have been the 6th person for them to try that on. And I decided to go online back then in 1998 to try to find answers. Those were really the early days, and there was very little content already up on the internet when I finally decided to take advantage of one of those AOL discs that everyone had hundreds of laying around the house and would decorate Christmas trees with, and plugged it in and got onto my landline connection, listening to all those screeches and howls, and finally discovered people with cluster headaches. I had never met anyone with cluster headaches up until that point. And we started to build a community. What that community was able to do was share ideas on what they were doing to get them through the day and to continue living. Everybody finds different things that help. Some people were feeling a cluster headache attack come on. They would go to the refrigerator, get a large bottle of Tabasco sauce and start drinking Tabasco sauce, which eventually led to some research looking at that. And there was actually a medication brought to market using the hot peppers that were made to make the Tabasco. I was in a clinical trial on that before it went into the clinics because the doctor that I was seeing was willing to try anything. Thank God for him. He kept me alive for 18 of those first 20 years.
And I'm going to interject here, Bob.
Go ahead.
This crowd wants to hear about the psychedelics, so let's get there.
I'm getting there. So part of this is to explain the unbelievable effect of psychedelics. I was online back in the 60s. There was a television program on, so most of you are probably too young to remember Gilligan's Island. But that's how we all felt on our chat group online. We really were set adrift from medicine because it hadn't done us any good. It was a perfect example of who was in our group. You know, we had people in there that had a lot of money that couldn't buy a thing. They could buy more with a coconut than with a check. Captain and a professor who knew some science and a lot of Gilligans, and very innovative group. And what we ended up finding were psychedelics. I'm here.
Perfect. Let's get into it.
And what we were able to discover together was some of the research that was being put online that we could find, and we were finding a lot of old research that we were able to connect with a lot of the different medications that we had been given and tried and were developed specifically from psychedelics and from early work with LSD. The most notable was back in the early 60s in Italy, and a lot came from that research. So we thought it might work, and somebody came to our group who had tried LSD, and his story was we always tried to figure out when any change happened in our cycle, and if you missed one attack, you'd try to figure out what it was that you had for dinner the night before, and you'd have that dinner for every night for a week. He came to the group. He had completely missed a cycle that he knew what time of the year it was going to start. It never started. The only thing he could figure out he had done differently was he had used LSD recreationally twice that summer, and his cycle did not start. He did a little bit of research, and then he came to our group asking questions. We did a lot of work together, and later on in 1998, it was my turn to try psychedelics to treat my cluster headaches rather than going for brain surgery. And it's a really nice picture that I like that really tells the story. I took the dose of psilocybin on the 4th of July with my entire family on blankets and chairs watching the fireworks with my favorite band, Pink Floyd, on my Walkman. And there's about 40,000 people in my town. I probably know 20,000 of them. Most of them knew about my cluster headaches. All of them knew what I was doing, and I was getting high-fived by not only half of the police force, but the police chief, who all played Little League Baseball for me, knew what I was going through and were just happy that I might find something that would work for me. So from that point on, I've always been very open about my psychedelic use, and I've never gotten so much as a text message from the DEA or anybody else. So, and my phone number is everywhere. So my experience with that broke a cycle that I couldn't break, ended my cycle early. It didn't just treat it. I didn't need to take it every day. I took 3 doses. The 3rd dose broke the cycle on that 4th of July, 1998. That experience and all my friendships that I had made on Gilligan's Island told me that I cannot take my treatment and go away and leave my life. I needed to let everyone know that this was available. I knew that it was going to be life-saving for many, many people. Back on suicidality, people with cluster headaches, suicide attempts are 20% the national average.
20 times, right?
20 times the national average for people with cluster headaches. And that's based on suicide attempts. We don't know if cluster people are better at committing suicide or worse. So it may be a few points up or down from that number. So we kept on working and figuring out what was going on. What we learned over years, this took years for us to do with citizen science to find out what this was. These are the main points using psilocybin, and also the same way with LSD, but we developed a busting regimen. We figured out how many doses of psilocybin it might take, the spacing between each dose, what medications on lists of hundreds that people were on, did they need to stop because it would block the effects of psilocybin or LSD. So we did all of that research, all of that data collection. We always started everyone at a very low dose for several reasons. One, if I'm trying to convince somebody with cluster headaches to use psychedelics, that is a 30-year-old single mother of 4, she can go to the doctor and get a medication that she can keep being a mother with. If you tell that mother that I've got something that might work, but you're going to be out of it for 6 hours, you can call into work and say, I can't be in today. You cannot call into your kids and say, I'm not going to be in today. And every individual has stories like that needs to be dealt with trying to treat the whole person. So we ended up with the best general dosing regimen, and dose size was between 1 gram and 1.5 grams of dried mushrooms, which is between 10 and 15 milligrams of psilocybin. Some people have a full-blown trip at 0.5 gram. Other people need 5 or 6 or 7. My vice president for a while used 7 grams of mushrooms to feel anything at all. So however it was that his body was metabolizing the mushrooms, he needed a very large dose. But the lowest dose that would work for a person was the one that was the best for them. And their body is the one that could tell them what to do with the dose. Did they need more? Did they need less? A doctor cannot tell you. A doctor cannot tell you what your body can tell you. I'm sure that most of you here that are experienced with psychedelic use know that and can really talk to their body and feel their body and feel that broken knee that they had 15 years ago. And it's like, wow, it's still there. That still aches.
I'm going to interject for a second here. So it's just interesting that when we look at the psychedelic space now, we see that it is so often on two poles. Either we're talking about microdosing or we're talking about full therapeutic doses. But Clusterbusters, what they figured out a long time ago is there's low doses, usually thought of as something that is perceptual. You do feel it. It's more than a microdose, but it's much less. It doesn't necessarily lead to full-on hallucinations or anything like that. And that is the dose that seems to be most effective for cluster headache, and we believe may be most effective for other pain conditions.
Right. And there are really a lot of benefits to this over anything that is on the market for treating headache disorders, which account for about 40 million people in the United States. 3 doses spaced apart can give lasting relief. For a cluster headache person, it can stop the cycle and the 3-month cycle in a week or 10 days rather than 3 months. And there is nothing on the market that can do that, even close.
And that is for busting or preventing the cycle. And there really was nothing there to use acutely early on, but now the world has more access to DMT. So what are we seeing there?
Okay, so for continuing our work and our research and working with our community, I'm really happy to report this is probably the first public announcement on this, to let anybody outside of my community know this, that DMT was thought about really early on with all of us that were doing this research. It was not something that we had enough information on to really recommend it for people, but it was always on the back of our minds. DMT now, once again, a low dose, 10 milligrams we're thinking with DMT, but it's really hard to get to know exactly how much you're getting. But a person with a vape pen with DMT that produces about 10 milligrams. Everybody's different, how deep they breathe, their lung capacity. But one inhalation on a DMT vape pen that you don't feel any results from in your physical being can stop a cluster headache attack in 30 seconds.
It's remarkable,
30
the
seconds.
reports that we're getting from the community. And just to interject, the way that it often has people get attacks in the middle of the night and they have their oxygen tank set up right next to the bed. They wake up as the pain comes on. They put that intensive oxygen mask on their face, and usually takes maybe about 10 minutes for it to have its effect. And during that time, the pain increases, the anxiety increases, and even if they're able to abort that attack, there's all that adrenaline, and they struggle to go back to sleep, and they might be having these attacks multiple times a night. But with DMT, we're now seeing people have that pen on the nightstand next to them. They wake up as that pain comes on. They take that one puff. Within 30 seconds, it stops that attack, and they're able to drift back off to sleep. It's really remarkable.
I had tried DMT because I try everything before I talk to my community about it. I won't recommend or talk about it without trying it. So I've tried a lot of different psychedelics. The first few times I tried DMT, I smoked it. I got whatever it is and put it into a pipe and lit it and smoked it. And I had no idea how much I was putting into the pipe. And it did work sometimes depending on how much I was taking, but I had no way of metering what I was taking. The first time I tried a DMT vape pen was on my nightstand. As Kevin said, my cluster started. I grabbed the vape pen and started walking to my oxygen tank. One inhalation, my cluster was gone before I got to my oxygen. And every time I did that, it worked, which is just an incredible discovery. When that happened to me, I had the same feeling I had when the mushrooms broke my cycle 25 years ago, that we need to work on this, we need to research this, we need to get this to my community. And honestly, I've personally talked to probably between 50 and 100 people with clusters that have tried this. None have been without some positive results. Most of them works just like I had. Some have a little more partial relief, but they're having to work on, do they need 2 inhalations? Do they need 3? Do they need to talk to a couple of aliens for 15 minutes? So they're all experimenting, and we're collecting that data to find out, what kind of a dose will do this. But now, because I have REM sleep triggered cluster headache attacks, I know that even when I used to walk to the oxygen tank and get rid of it in 10 minutes, then if I knew that if I went back to bed, I'd be back at the oxygen tank an hour later. The same thing happens with the DMT. It only treats that one attack, but I never have to take my head off of the pillow. I can stop the attack and go right back to sleep again. And without worrying about having to get up. It's like, whatever, I'll be back at this in an hour. I'll probably have a dream that was going to wake me up anyways. So yeah, it's something amazing. And it happened so fast that at least I could actually, it felt like I could physically feel exactly where that DMT went to in my brain, and I could feel it flipping a switch. Yeah, this is certainly going to be a focus of a lot of our work going forward. Back to those discussions about talking to my community and convincing them that the dose that we're talking about is not going to be a problem. You aren't going to have to talk to the elephant in a room. The elephant is not going to be in the room. This deer was actually in the room with me, and that's my son, who was about 5.5 when my cluster started, and there was playing poker with me up in Wisconsin with the deer head that we took off the wall and played some poker with. So some critical lessons learned through all of this work that we've done and collected. This comes from based on talking to thousands of people individually, one at a time, and talking them through the process and having them and helping them find the treatment that worked best for them, which is really different than the way clinical trials work. If you get one that's FDA approved, it costs millions and millions of extra dollars in clinical trial and years to be able to come up with a system where somebody in that clinical trial can adjust their dosages. So most clinical trials, they do some science and they figure out what they think is going to be the most effective. And if they decide that 10 milligrams of DMT is going to be the most effective, everyone in the room in the trial is going to get 10 milligrams of DMT. Everyone's going to get it dosed the way they say, every other day or 4 times a day. And then they hope that those numbers are successful enough and show enough significance to move forward. And that is something that we did on our own because, number one, financing. We've always financed everything almost exclusively by the patient community itself, making their $10 donations and us respecting those donations because we know how much that $10 means to them, because we know how difficult it is to hold a job for 40 years living with this disease. So those are the things we started learning about, being able to adjust the dose. When the Yale study coming up was done, Emanuel Schindler, picked the dose that we had developed, the dosing regimen that we had developed, and did show that in the end that the success was significant in numbers, significant enough to move on with more research, which then becomes much more expensive. But it cost us doing this, the cost of an AOL membership and $10 worth of spores. And for us to see this sort of thing go onto the market and spend all these hundreds of millions of dollars in years to get it there, and then to see the market tell us that, well, yeah, you can get a dose, but it's going to cost you $1,500 and you need to make an appointment. It's going to take you 6 weeks. Our people don't need to hear that because in 6 weeks, they're either their cycle's going to be gone or they can't live that long. And they could treat it they could grow a year's supply of medicine in their home for $100. The first year I switched over to growing mushrooms, I stopped spending $20,000 a year in medicine and went down to $100 a year. And I've never had to go back to spending $20,000 a year and spending weeks inpatient. We have a huge struggle now on access for people and how it's going to be a part of our lives and who's going to be able to get access, who's going to be able to afford access, or are they going to continue growing mushrooms in their home? I'd say 50% of our community won't take anything unless it's FDA approved. If they can't go to Walgreens and buy it, and their government telling them that it's safe, all they can know is the last 40 or 50 years of the news that they've heard about LSD and magic mushrooms. And
yeah, if I can put emphasis to that point, it was fascinating when we did a survey, and you'll see a chart from it, that people often assume, the Clusterbusters community, everyone there is using psychedelics for their cluster headache. And when we surveyed our community, we found that about half were not willing to. There's just a huge segment of society that is not going to try something unless their doctor recommends it, unless it's prescribed, unless they could pick it up at their local pharmacy. So this is sort of, it shapes, as you'll see, some of our public policy perspectives is a multi-model approach, recognizing that we want ways that are through the medical channel, ways that are with facilitation, ways that are responsible for independent use, recognizing different people have different thresholds of what they're willing to do. Let's move on to the research.
Yep. So once again, just really quickly on these lessons, that larger doses are not only not needed, but can be less effective and produce more side effects that might get people to stop trying it. And doses, the most important that we found is that doses are needed at home on demand. If they know that they're going to start a cycle, they need their medicine that day. The sooner you treat a cluster headache cycle, the easier it is to treat it and end it. And the sooner you get onto a acute medication to treat an attack, there's a huge difference between being able to treat it within minutes, because that's how fast the pain comes on, within minutes, lasts an hour, and stops within minutes. So those people need that medicine in their medicine chest, not even calling for a prescription to be filled. So what we also learned over the last 25 years are all of the obstacles and gatekeepers between somebody having a really good idea that could be a wonderful thing for the health of humanity and all of the things that stand in the way of bringing that to the people. As far as I know, the study that we got published out of Harvard in 2006, which was the first study that I know of that Harvard allowed, and even allowed the word psychedelics to be spoken within those hallowed halls, with being banned there for 40 years. As far as I know, every pain study that has been done after that was because of the data that we collected and our citizens collected and shared. Everyone that's ever done research that I've met has told me that we are the ones where they got the information to start with and use that data to convince their IRB at whatever institution they are working at to approve that study.
And it really is remarkable. If you remember, nowadays when you look at the news, there's psychedelic studies coming out in the medical literature all the time, in popular press. But back in this era, the early 2000s, there wasn't much showing up at all. And this was key work that they did and got Harvard to publish, showing that, as reported by patients, psilocybin and LSD were remarkably effective. And we'll see a chart in a next couple of slides here. So let's move on.
Right. So, yeah, it was huge to get that published in 2006. And that's a picture of myself with Rick Doblin from MAPS and the researcher that we hired at Harvard to do this. And even though it was much harder to sell at Harvard than anywhere else, that was the one that we chose to stick with, because we knew we had learned enough to know that any results coming out of Harvard would push the research much quicker than something coming out of Arizona State or anywhere else. And that was very true. So here's the results of one of the studies that came out of Yale, where we do most
of our... Not too bad, Harvard and Yale are what Clusterbusters is working with.
Yeah, I also walked into the halls of Yale with a high school diploma and convinced them to do our work. This chart shows the efficacy of psilocybin. The treatment that we developed, the pulse regimen, showed enough success that it reached the level line that you need to cross over of significance, with enough people in the study and enough of a significant change in their cluster headache pattern. This is another study that isn't published yet. We're done collecting the data, and our reports are being written up by the lead investigators now and will be published soon. And I don't know, hopefully you can read that, or at least some of it. If not, I can explain a little bit about this. So all the red lines is showing complete failure of whatever medication that was in the studies, but more importantly, within the patient community. There's an awful lot of times that something is approved by the FDA and they're coming out and saying you're going to have a 62% success rate, but that number never changes when it gets out to the public, and it's really only a 30% increase in efficacious dosing. So the longer the red line, the less useful all of those medications are for treating cluster headache.
As you can see, the whole row of the medications that are commonly used for cluster headache, the ones with the green labels, those are sort of the standards of care. Nice to see that they're more towards the left side in terms of what the medical field offers. but the 3 on the far left with the yellow labels,
Four.
Four of them, yes. 4 of them on the far left. Those are all the psychedelics. And they have much larger efficacy than anything that medicine has available right now. So it's charts like this that give us the passion that we have to say we've got to get the word out about these substances. We've got to advance research. We've got to advance access to these substances.
I hate this chart only because of how it shows and how you have to figure out how well of a job these things are doing to treat people. And something that we're looking at now is, because we can survey the patients themselves, all those areas in blue are levels of how well it was working. But that doesn't really explain that. Yeah, psilocybin has the dark blue up on top, and it's surpassed a little bit down the road there. But all of that other blues, even the lightest blue, a cluster headache sufferer, for 10% reduction in their cluster headache attacks alone will keep them on whatever that medication is. That 10% will keep them from committing suicide. One really important thing here is that we learned from the patients is, and what this chart doesn't show is, you can see how efficacious psilocybin is. Most of those people that are showing the efficacy of LSD are patients that either got partial relief from psilocybin or couldn't quite get over the line and completely cure their cycle. They would try LSD because we think LSD is actually more effective. So the majority of those people, and most of them I've spoken to, switched over to LSD and broke cycles that psilocybin wouldn't. Here's all of the people, or a part of the people that were on Gilligan's Island with me at our conference, which has more cluster patients in the room than any neurologist will see in a lifetime, other than maybe 6 that actually see a lot of them. And to close out, if you want to learn more about my 25-year struggle, you can pick up that book. I mean, it took 300 pages to describe what I just described in 20. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Bob. Fantastic presentation. I'll move through quickly. We want to have plenty of time for Q&A here. So I am both Bob's employee, working as the policy director for Clusterbusters, and colleague as the executive director of the Psychedelics and Pain Association. A little bit about my background. For 20 years, I've been working in politics and healthcare policy. 15 of those years focused around pain. I started off creating an opioid safety coalition back in the very, very early days of the opioid crisis. Worked with the U.S. Pain Foundation at that time, has been a great partner ever since. Went on to spend 5 years as the executive director of CHAMP, the Coalition for Headache and Migraine Patients. And then about 3 years started working with Clusterbusters, and 2 years ago starting the Psychedelics and Pain Association. On the personal side, my best friend is here, Katie Golden, who's been doing her best to keep us all on track with time. She had always lived her life with episodic migraine, and then in 2011, she got a migraine that never went away, and it was years of constant head pain, and it would ebb and flow a little bit, but the pain was always there. At the time, neither of us even knew that chronic migraine like that was even possible. Tried so many different medications, seeing so many different doctors, nothing working. And then through the counsel and guidance of Bob Wold, she tried psilocybin. And that was the first thing that gave her absolute total pain freedom. And it was an absolute beautiful moment to watch and to share with her. And really, for me, inspired me to recognize the potential of these psychedelic substances to help people, particularly those who are intractable and not responding to other things. So the creation of PPA, as you can imagine, is hard enough to get people to pay attention to cluster headache. They haven't heard of it, and we're not reaching everyone who can be helped. So to make our advocacy efforts easier and to expand our reach, created the PPA. There are 3 founding organizations. Clusterbusters is one of them. The other one is Joe Moore from Psychedelics Today, which is the largest media platform. I know he's met you before. He says hello. And then Court Wing with Remap Therapeutics, which is really focused on individual help and trying to bring that to help some of these more difficult cases and guide them through that process. Also want to acknowledge here that this would not be possible without the support of the River Styx Foundation. We have Cody Swift here and Magali. And Magali raised her hand early on and she said, not only do we want to help provide some seed funding for this organization, but I want to roll up my sleeves and get in there with you. And she's now our director of operations and vital to everything we do. So round of applause for them. Big thanks. And they recently moved here to the Santa Barbara community, so expect to see them at more of these events. Okay, chronic pain. We all know the impact. It's recently estimated 60 million Americans live with chronic pain, and it really destroys lives. It destroys your ability to move, your ability to work, your ability to spend time with your family. It is so interruptive. And yet in the midst of this chronic pain epidemic, we also have an opioid epidemic. And that has led to a pushback on the use of opioids, which are really one of the most effective tools that have been in the arsenal. And yes, it has downsides, very clear downsides that we all need to be aware of. But by curtailing them so much, we've really left a lot of people with untreated pain. So there's a massive need out there to find other things that work, ideally things that are non-lethal, non-addictive. So what is pain? A lot of people think of pain as it's a signal that comes up from damage. You drop that 100-pound piece of wood on your foot and you feel that. But the truth is there are these ascending signals, but pain is really a perception. It is a way that your brain is making sense of the various inputs and responding to it. So it's very complex. And many people with chronic pain are not able to point to any type of a causal injury. They've either recovered from the surgery or there's just no visible damage, yet they're still, their body and their mind is on a heightened system of heightened pain sensation. So it creates a big challenge. It's very complex and it's dynamic. So the more accurate, more recent model of thinking about pain is this thing called the biopsychosocial model of pain, where it's looking at all three inputs that are involved. The biological factors, all types of psychological factors, and then the social as well, the type of support that you have. Unfortunately, our medical system is generally not as good at providing support in the psychological and social realms. And even nowadays in the medical realm, they're more restricted. So it's very dynamic and challenging. Which brings us to psychedelics for pain. The complexity of psychedelics that most people in this room here are aware of is a good match for the complexity of pain. And want to start with recognizing that so much of the work that we're doing in this space is based on the indigenous use of psychedelic substances, which goes back thousands and thousands of years. Some of the earliest archaeological evidence is 9,000 years old. And those cultures often don't have the same separation that we do in the Western medicine between the body and the mind. They view it holistically. And so when they're treating pain, they're treating physical pain, psychological pain, and spiritual pain. And so all the work that we're doing is so built on this, and we want to start with acknowledging that. So PPA has built a database of more than 70 studies, all available on our website, psychedelicsandpain.org, going back to the late 1800s. That first study that we found in the medical literature was looking at what they called mescal buttons and finding that it was potential usefulness for headache as well as abdominal pain. Then there was a surge of studies that came out in the 60s and 70s. We'll highlight some of those. There was the crackdown on access and research on psychedelics. And then we've seen another surge of research in the 2000s, really with Clusterbusters driving the research in the early 2000s and now a much broader range. So all these conditions listed on this slide have shown signal to respond to psychedelics. And it's a challenging space to be in. A lot of people say, well, is it proven? Can you prove it? We're early, even though we've been doing this for many years, and being able to create that definitive proof. But there are either studies or case studies that are indicating that all of these conditions, many of the most widely held pain conditions, respond to psychedelics. And that's what informs the inspiration for our work, trying to push more research to figure out. Our questions are, which psychedelic, at what dose, on what schedule, and potentially with what adjunctive therapies is optimal to treat chronic pain? And we may find that there's different answers for these different conditions. And that's the work that's ongoing. So looking back, I'll give you a chance to look. These are some of the hallmark studies that happened in the 1960s and 1970s. So the first one, Secretary, looking at LSD for migraine. As Bob had sort of mentioned, it's not surprising. The LSD is similar to DHE, which is another ergotamine medicine. So there's a biological similarity there. Another big one that I'll highlight is the Caston-Collins, which was comparing LSD in cancer patients, and it compared it to two different types of opioids. And that study found that not only was there a stronger pain relief, but much more importantly, it was much longer lasting. Going out 3 weeks, there were people who obviously after 8 to 12 hours, they were getting no more relief from the opioids, but they were still reporting significant reductions in their pain because of the psychedelic. That's just a quick snapshot on some of the older studies. As we said, Clusterbusters and cluster headache was driving a lot of the attention in the early 2000s. But then you get to 2018, where there was a interesting case study that was reported by Albert Lin. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He has a National Geographic show. And he was in a car accident, ended up with a mangled leg. He selected to have it amputated, thinking that that would solve the problem. But he ended up with phantom limb pain, which is an extreme condition, but it points out the point I was making about pain being in the brain. It's a perception, not a signal. There's no limb. There's no possible sense, but they feel this intense, throbbing, burning pain. And it obviously is, how do you treat that as the medical community? So he was aware of the work that Clusterbusters had done and psilocybin for pain. He was also aware of a therapy called mirror box therapy. That's where you use a mirror and then you're able to trick your brain into see a healthy limb where you are missing a limb. And he did that, got a little bit of relief, but it was short lasting. And his idea was, what if we combine these things? Combining psychedelics with the mirror box, huge impact, almost dropped down to zero pain, and it sustained endurance. So it's really phenomenal and brought a lot of attention to this area. Going to 2021, we talked about Emanuel Schindler. This is a study that she did expanding from cluster headache to migraine, showing the reduction in the number of headache attacks as a result of a single dose of psilocybin, not even the pulse regimen that we have reason to think is more effective. 2022, there were the studies going on around MDMA and PTSD. So one of them did a sub-analysis looking at people who were being treated for PTSD, but they also asked them questions about their pain. And we're surprised to see this huge reduction in the amount of pain that they had. And those who were reporting the most pain had the most significant reductions. And it's important because there's no expectancy bias in this research here. These people were not expecting to take the psychedelics and help with their chronic pain condition. They were focused on their PTSD, yet it had this effect. So that definitely got a lot of attention there. There was a survey study done at Maastricht University, looked at over 250 individuals, a variety of pain conditions, how they related the efficacy of a variety of treatments. They reported, as you can see, that there was more efficacy from psychedelics than all the other things, and particularly the macro doses. We sort of wish there had been a low dose category, but as we've noted, that's largely not included in things. So that leads to, how does this work? And it's a great question, and there are theories out there, and I'm going to go through some of the leading theories about this, but the truth is, we're still figuring out so much, and this is true of all of psychedelics. As far as the research is, we don't have definitive answers. So if anyone wants to dig deep on this, the seminal paper is by Joel Castellano in 2020. He's a researcher at UC San Diego. He now works closely with us in the Psychedelics and Pain Association, looking at a review of these studies and theorizing some of these mechanisms of action. So the first one is on that serotonin pathway. So we know that the classic psychedelics are activating that 5-HT2A receptor. And that serotonin pathway is related to pain, the descending inhibition, which means that those pain signals coming up are inhibited from activating pain. So it's activating the body's natural pain diminishing response. And so that's one of the key ways that we think that they're being effective. Another way is neuroplasticity. So we know that a brain when it's on psychedelics, and these are images of connections across brain areas, it allows people to form new connections. And for people who are in chronic pain, they often describe it as being stuck in a rut. Their brain is stuck in this feeling of being trapped with their pain. But the psychedelics allow them to form these new connections, break out of that rut, and it really is helpful in setting those, and that neuroplastic window that they've identified after using psychedelics that can last days to weeks allows those connections and new ways of thinking to really take hold. So then there's the anti-inflammatory effects. See if we got the chart there. So inflammation is the body's healthy response to injury or damage. And so you want a system that does that, but it can go haywire. People end up with chronic inflammation, and they need that inflammation knocked down. They need their system to put back into regulation. And so there's some research being done by a researcher named Chuck Nichols looking at the anti-inflammatory effects of psychedelics. And he's finding that psychedelics have some of the highest properties that science is aware of in terms of anti-inflammatories. One in particular, research chemical DOI, has been shown to be over 700 times as strong as an anti-inflammatory than corticosteroids. So just off the chart strength of these. So we think that another key mechanism is in that anti-inflammatory effect. And then of course there's the psychological reframing. Like I mentioned, people thinking about their pain, identifying as someone in pain. And so we want to make sure that we acknowledge that there is some ability for people to think about themselves, their relationship to their pain, and that's important. It's relevant, but there's more going on at the biological level as well. So I'm going to get into psychedelic policy. I am a policy nerd, and I think that and it's important to sort of know what's going on. I want to go quickly so we can get to questions, but there's been a lot of legislation that's either been passed or it's been discussed about in various places. There's a quick snapshot map. Oregon, I think a lot of you are familiar. They have the facilitation model. And they also, at the same time, there was another initiative that voters approved that was decriminalization of all drugs. So it took a little while. They did a great job of creating regulations to get those in place. The service centers offering the facilitated psilocybin began in 2023. Unfortunately, the decrim effort was not as successful. There was supposed to be an increase in funding and availability for drug abuse support services. That didn't happen. There was concurrent with the rise of fentanyl, and there was public drug use. And just responding to the backlash, the legislature ended up repealing all of the drug decriminalization. Even though psychedelics were not seen as part of the problem, they repealed it all. So no longer is there decriminalization of psychedelics in Oregon. And while they've had tremendous success with efficacy and with safety of their facilitated access, the problem is it's expensive. $1,500 to $3,000 is the cost to do one of the cycles where you have a preparation session, your administration session, and then your integration session. And the result is that it's not used very much. There's only about 5,000 people who experienced facilitated psilocybin in Oregon this past year, where it's estimated that more than 300,000 people in Oregon are using psychedelics every year. So the vast majority of people are using outside of the system when it comes to that way. DC, the same year, 2020, passed a decriminalization measure. It's a little bit wild that the way, and so it doesn't create legalized sales, to be clear, decriminalized versus legalized. But the practical effect where decriminalization happens is that gray markets stand up, and there's different formats for it. The way it works in DC is they start off with the cannabis shops doing gifting, where you would go in, you would ask to buy a piece of, Xerox paper, and then they would gift you psilocybin with it. They moved away from that model, and it's pretty much just a direct transaction at this point. And you can buy a wide variety of forms of psilocybin, a wide range of DMT. The problem is there's no regulation. You have to just trust that what they are selling you is what they claim that it is. And we have struggled with that. It's expanded access, but it's not safe in that sense. Colorado, I'll just mention briefly, 2022, their voters passed both decriminalization as well as facilitation of natural psychedelics. They've been working on those regulations. They'll be launching what they're calling healing centers early this year. Unfortunately, we anticipate it's still going to be expensive, still limited access. They will have 2 tiers of facilitators where it's very explicit in Oregon. You're not able to provide concurrent health services. Even if you have a therapist license, you need to keep them separate. Here, they're going to have what are called facilitators or clinical facilitators. And those clinical facilitators will be able to practice their medicine at the same time as facilitating sessions. There, I understand there's not really so much availability to buy psilocybin at cannabis shops there, but online they sell psilocybin stickers, and then the gifting of the psilocybin for delivery happens as well. Massachusetts, there was a ballot initiative just past election 2024. It was going to do both decriminalization as well as facilitated access to the listed natural psychedelics there. Unfortunately, after a robust campaign, it failed. And that has really sent a lot of the policy advocates back to the drawing board, figuring out where the public is on this, what's passable, what we can do. So this is the model that we really believe in. And we got the chair of the Assembly Health Committee in New York to endorse this idea and introduce this as her bill. Last session is currently being updated a little bit. But the idea being there's got to be a better way. We need broader access with people in the system buying regulated product, having safe support available, but not as expensive. So this model, trying to combine some of the best aspects of medical marijuana and the facilitation models, are people had to do a health screening. Want to make sure we're identifying those criteria that would make them not good candidates to be using psychedelics. They pass through that health screening. They then would take a 5-hour education course, learning about the safe use of psilocybin. We think that education is really important here. And once they pass that course, take a test, pass the test, then they can purchase a permit. And those permit holders are able to not only grow, possess, and independently use, but they can buy regulated psilocybin from cultivators in the state. So you have safe supply, safe use because of the education, and then we have a new tier, not facilitators, we're calling them support services providers, believing that it's going to be a lower amount of training, a cheaper amount of cost. They can provide these harm reduction services either in their own home, the home of the individual permit holder, or other spaces. And so you really reduce costs compared to what we're seeing in Oregon, what we anticipate seeing in Colorado. So this is what we believe is the better way forward to get people to be having safe, educated access. And we're trying to get more states to adopt it. We're trying to get it to pass somewhere. California, we're here. This is, it's been a journey. Who here has been paying close attention to the journey here in California? Okay. We were so close. 2023, the legislature, both parts, passed a bill that was going to lead to facilitated access as well as decriminalization. We all celebrated. We thought we were there. We thought the Democratic governor would sign this. He did not. He ended up vetoing it and saying that he wanted to focus on therapeutic access. Very disappointing for the advocates. We went back to the drawing board. Senator Wiener is the sponsor for that previous legislation. He said, all right, I'm going to bring a bill that just does the facilitated access. But it got bottled up in committee because the reality is of these facilitation programs, they're so small, there's not a way to generate enough revenue to cover the costs of the program. And they said this is going to be a net negative cost. So unfortunately, that one got bottled up. And then there was another initiative called Heal Our Heroes Act. It was 2 senators, one from Menlo Park, one from San Diego, bipartisan. Was going to be just allowing up to 5 psilocybin facilitation centers in 3 different counties, and with services only available to veterans and former first responders. That didn't go anywhere, but they're leading individuals now trying to figure out what the exact policy is going to look like. Some type of pilot program. Things are looking very scaled back. But in California, we have the ballot initiative process. And there's an organization, a church up in San Francisco that has previously tried to do ballot initiatives. Unfortunately, it's hard to raise the money and get all the signatures you need, but they plan to do it again, pushing for a broader model that's a little bit like the personal psilocybin permit model with access to natural psychedelics. So that's sort of where California is at, a lot of moving pieces there. Encourage everyone to get involved. There's a huge amount of questions about what's going to happen at the federal level. Who's going to be in charge of HHS? Who's going to be directing policy? Oddly enough, there's some reason to think that there might be some more open minds in the Republican administration. So we'll see what happens. But right now, everyone is waiting to see who gets where and then how serious they are about pushing expanded access to psychedelics. I'll end with just a little bit of a snapshot of PPA. This is our organization. We have a network of the people who are providing facilitated services, or they're researchers or healthcare providers who are interested, really the leaders in the space. We're trying to bring them together, form those connections, advance things. We'll be building an online community to provide credible information and allow people to share their experiences. We work on the advocacy and policy, public awareness. We've been involved in a lot of news articles bringing attention to psychedelics for chronic pain, because we often get left behind with a focus on mental health or substance use disorders. And then training and education. We have a 8-hour course. It's all for free. It's available on our website, and it has the world's leading experts on psychedelics for pain talking about their different areas of expertise. So please visit our website, sign up for our mailing list. Would love to have your support. I'm going to end there. So we've thrown a lot of information at you. We have a microphone. Just raise your hand and let's have an open discussion here, Q&A.
I was about to plug you for finally getting to California. I was going to tell you you're taking too long to get there.
I appreciate that. Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, guys. Is the protocol using LSD the same as the psilocybin protocol in terms of the pulsing schedule and just a mini dose?
Yeah, it's the exact same schedule for trying to break a cycle. So they'll take, usually the dose for that is like 100 micrograms.
100 mics.
100 mics. And I would take 100 mics and go to work. When I was in a cycle, okay, and when I was in a cycle and had to go to work and was going through, like, if I wasn't doing this, I would go through 3 or 4 attacks during that day, and there's no way I could work with that. I would take 25 micrograms with my coffee in the morning and go to work, and I'd have a headache all day and climb ladders and walk on roofs. That's 25 mics.
That's 25 mics, huh?
Right. But the same regimen is used for LSD and psilocybin.
So you're saying anywhere from 25 to 100 mics that would be the range to dose?
Right. 25 mics doesn't seem to be enough to affect the long-term cycle. So you're not going to break that cycle. But once you start getting up to the 100 mic range, you get really longer lasting results.
Thank you guys so much.
Sure.
Just a wealth of knowledge. It was. Thank you.
Thank you guys both for all that information. Just for everyone in the crowd knows, I read the book, Psychedelic Outlaws. Highly, highly recommended. Super great, super informative. And I brought a copy of it so I can personally attest to how good it is. Pick up copy. One thing that they talk about in the book that I think is worth noting, and this crosses the line between the biological and the social compound, is that with cluster headache, in my experience, and probably with migraine as well, alcohol is a trigger. Alcohol almost always will start an attack. I read about the gentleman who triggered his own attack and then using alcohol, using some scotch, and then aborted it with psychedelics. But it's one of those things where alcohol is so ubiquitous in society. Everywhere you turn, at every corner that you turn, it's there. And I work in hospitality, so I'm not anti-alcohol per se. Like, prohibition didn't work. But I think it's worth noting that something that is so universal and around it all the time can actually make these chronic issues worse. And people may not have access to that information because alcohol is so normalized in every part of our lives every time you turn around. So I think it's maybe good to also bring attention to the fact that that we know what can stop it, but let's also let people know sometimes things need to stay away from that can start it as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and people with clusters especially stop drinking when they go in a cycle, and they'll sell their stock at Budweiser and go in a cycle, and if they're not in cycle, it usually won't trigger an attack, but people just stop drinking, and yes, we try everything. So yeah, I mean, we've had people test it out and see what happens and what changes can happen. And so yeah, alcohol is one huge trigger for clusters, and I'm sure it's triggers for a lot of other chronic pain conditions.
Yep.
But we don't have good treatments for chronic pain, so people use what they have. And if they need to go to the bar every night to be able to come home and go to sleep, that's what they use because they don't have access to anything else.
And you talked about alcohol being this social connector in our society. It's part of what I think the Clusterbusters does. We call it the double magic. And a lot of people focus on the magic of the substance, but the other part is the magic of the community. Bringing people together, providing the information, providing support, connecting them with other people who have a condition that's so rare they often haven't met anyone else in their real lives who has that condition, forming those connections, and that combined with the psychedelic medicine is that double magic, and also creating a community where a lot of people are not drinking and are all comfortable like that.
Yeah, just a real success story for our community. We have a lot of data showing that psychedelics treat what's now being talked about as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, where people, and that can be sometimes piled on to post-traumatic stress that somebody already has, but then they get cluster headaches, and that makes it complex because they're living that trauma 8 times a day. And how do you treat that? And the way we treat that is low-dose psilocybin, low-dose LSD, and it cuts their post-traumatic stress diagnosis scores from 30, the diagnostic range, where people not using psychedelics are scoring in the 80s. People using psychedelics are scoring 15 or 10, and a third of that diagnostic range. And that's at low doses. That's at 1 gram or 1.5 grams, which also runs counter to all of the treatment now for mental health, where they're talking about large doses. We have tens of thousands of people that have treated their post-traumatic stress disorder with 1 gram or 1.5 grams, and not with a therapist. They do that, and all of you that know how you feel with 1 gram or 1.5 grams, they do that in a 4-hour session with somebody that loves them, and they spend that time laughing and then sometimes switching over to crying and getting a hug from their wife and from their loved one, their mother, whoever it might be, and really changes their thinking about their situation and their life with cluster headaches and all of the shame and guilt that they're dealing with. And both the caregivers and the patients feel those things.
And we're nearing end time. Is there any last question or two?
Hi. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good to see you.
Nice to see you as well.
It's just a share. I don't know if you guys are aware of this nonprofit in Canada called Therapies. They actually treated their first cluster headache patient just a few months ago, and that's outside of a clinical trial. That's with Health Canada's approval, and that was just amazing. An amazing feat for the community, so I just wanted to share that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah,
Yep.
We're a little bit involved in that, and just like they have this expanded access program in Canada, and they were able to get the first cluster headache patient through, and now they're trying to get more through for legal access to psilocybin.
I became a prescriber last year, and it's not perfect. It's very hard to get patients through, but the fact that this wasn't an end-of-life patient, technically, but cluster headaches can make you feel like you're at the end of life and make you want to take your life. And so they were able to make a case for this patient. I thought that was really incredible.
It was a huge breakthrough for our community here.
Yeah, it was great.
Great. Last thing. Anything? Oh, wait, up here, and then we'll be done.
Hi. I work in healthcare. I do primarily like neuro rehab therapy for patients. I obviously see a lot of implications for this to be an amazing tool for a lot of people. But of course, working for a healthcare company, I cannot legally tell these patients like, hey, what do you think about this? So I guess I have 2 questions. Is this contraindicated for any populations that you guys have worked with? And 2, are there routes for me to legally, be able to recommend this to patients or to get involved in other ways that I could spread it to these patient populations? I think it could be really beneficial for.
Absolutely. I'll say that in Oregon, they decided that the one exclusion would be use of lithium, that they thought that there was an increased risk of seizures with that. Beyond that, there's just sort of general warnings of concerns about if you're concurrently using SSRIs or SNRIs, potential risk of serotonin syndrome, although the reality of that occurring is minimal. It's more, it seems, theoretical risk than a real one. And Dr. Brian McGeaney is someone that we work with in the cluster headache community who's always very clear that, doctors have First Amendment rights. And while you cannot necessarily prescribe or direct them to do something, what he often says is, I really think you should check out this organization, Clusterbusters, and see what might be there for you to his cluster headache patients, or direct them to PPA, or say, hey, I came across an interesting study, wanted to share it with you. Leading them a certain direction without going as far as to direct them to do it. Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. There's studies on bipolar disorder right now to see. Results haven't come out yet, but yeah, those are other concerns.
Yeah. Well, after years of being told that people with mental health conditions are really advised to stay away completely from psychedelics. And now, that's really the main focus. So they aren't turning away the people that we've been trained to turn away for the last 40 years. We tell all of our community when they ask questions about what do they do about their doctor, number one, we recommend that they discuss this with their doctor. It's important. The doctor is the one that knows their entire health history and their health. I can't trust these people telling me everything because sometimes they won't share some of the things that they might think that I might tell them to stay away from it. So we recommend strongly that they talk to their doctor. And the way to do that is just print out a research paper. It's really easy to do, and you can bring in 2 sheets of paper and ask your doctor what his thoughts are on this. You don't have to ask him to prescribe it for you, but he can certainly tell you his feelings, knowing your health history and whether or not he thinks it might be safe, and point you in other directions. We've only had one person out of thousands that have gone to their doctor and had their doctor tell them that if you try this, I cannot treat you anymore. Because that's a huge fear for people going in. And we've only had that happen with one person. Yeah.
I just want to touch on your question about neuro rehab, because I imagine you're working with people with a bunch of different types of complex pain, and give you some more resources for that. And also note that one of the fears that some people with chronic pain have going into using psychedelics for pain is, well, can this make my pain worse? I'm going to be in a heightened state. They may be new to psychedelics generally. Will this get worse? There's not a ton of research on it. There is one paper that looked at that, and there were, I think, 3 patients out of, I think it was 100 or 150 people in that survey, who the pain was made worse during the acute phase of their experience, but it went back down to baseline or less. So the overwhelming majority of what we hear and what we've seen in the research is that the pain actually doesn't get worse. It may remain the same, and for a lot of people it gets better, but that is rare. It should be, it's something to mention, and it's another note towards, again, lowest effective dose for pain is usually where you want to start, rather than giving someone a big dose right away. What is the lowest effective dose to start touching in on the pain? And then on the neuro rehab or adjunctive therapies, I'm sure you can imagine all of these potential possibilities, right, for how these things can be combined, whether it's neuro rehab specifically, or it's massage therapy, or it's physical therapy, traditional physical therapy, etc. So we're trying to figure out what people are doing now as citizen scientists who, are combining these things. And one of the organizations that forms PPA is Remap Therapeutics, where we're working specifically with neuromodulation and neurorehab while people are under the influence of psychedelics to support them with complex pain conditions. So our new website for that is launching this week, and we'll have an inquiry form for folks who can just write in and talk to our team and say, this is what I'm thinking about doing, or this is what I'm working with, and general advice, or they can come and actually work with us at one of our retreats or our individual one-on-one sessions. And also you could sign up for our professional network. If you're interested in this, then you'll be kind of kept in the loop of what we're doing and what the professionals in our network are talking about. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. And Thank you to everyone for your attendance tonight, for your attention. We hope you took something out of this. We'll be around if you have individual